Good morning, everyone. There. All right. Good morning, everyone. Hopefully the microphone is working. I'd like to welcome everybody to our session this morning, U.S. government support for natural climate solutions implementation. We have a really tremendous panel, and I'm happy to be a part of it. I'd like to thank everyone in our in-person audience for joining us here at the Nature Positive Hub. I hope everyone's having a good New York City Climate Week so far. I'd like to thank everyone also in our online audience for live casting the session today. I anticipate a really great conversation. I am Dan Bresette. I'm the president of the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. We're based in Washington, D.C. We're a climate policy nonprofit focusing on congressional education about the widest possible range of climate change topics. We also do work in rural areas, helping rural utilities make clean energy more affordable and accessible to their customers. But today we're here to talk about natural climate solutions. And I'd like to thank our event sponsor, U.S. Nature for Climate, for pulling us all together today. U.S. Nature for Climate is a coalition of 20 organizations, conservation, environmental, and sustainable business organizations dedicated to ensuring that natural climate solutions have an important role to play in mitigating and adapting to climate change and being a big part of our efforts to combat the climate crisis. ESI counts itself proudly as one of those 20 organizations. U.S. Nature for Climate provides a collaborative and effective platform for people to come together to talk about these issues. And a big part of this work is about engaging the public and engaging policymakers. And that's especially relevant for our session today. If you're following the news in Washington, it sounds like everyone's consumed with the impending government shutdown. That's true, but there are other things as well, including the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, perhaps in the intermediate term, a farm bill. And so there's a lot of policy work happening in Washington that might not be in the headlines right now, but that's super important and very relevant to natural climate solutions. And reaching the public and policymakers is a big goal of this session. It's a big goal of what U.S. Nature for Climate does. They also provide great resources. And if you're not familiar with U.S. Nature for Climate, I encourage you to visit them online. Their website is www.usnatureforclimate.org. They have a lot of great stuff, including just from August, the release of a poll results, finding that 92% of American voters would like to see more investment in terms of natural climate solutions. And in order to get to 92% of Americans, you have to have a lot of bipartisan support. You have to have a lot of support from across the political spectrum. And so that's one reason why ESI spends so much time talking about natural climate solutions. We have a very tremendous panel today, and I've already forgotten to advance the slides, but it's good because the clicker doesn't work. So that's an out. I mean, the turtle's cute, so what was the name of the turtle in Nemo? I don't remember. There it goes. U.S. Nature for Climate. Our session today is going to be structured around a panel discussion. And before that, we have some introductory remarks. And I'll introduce our panelists as we go. Everyone's going to have, our panelists will have about 12 or so minutes to make presentations. And then we'll have a Q&A session. And if you know me, you know that I have questions all lined up and ready to go for our panelists. But I really hope that we'll have a robust discussion here in the room. So folks in our in-person audience, if you have questions, we'll do our best to incorporate those into our discussion when we get to that. Our first speaker today is Sacha Spector. Sacha is the director of the environment program at the Doris Duke Foundation. And Sacha's agreed to join us today to provide some introductory remarks before we get into the panel discussion. So Sacha, I'll have a seat. I'll invite you to the front of the room and really looking forward to your remarks.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm Sacha Spector, and I work at the Doris Duke Foundation. We're a 25-year-old foundation based here in New York, and we work here across the U.S. on nature, climate, and equity issues, really focused on the land sector and how we can deliver on all three of those challenges. We've been a proud supporter of Nature for Climate since its founding, and now and bringing that model here to the U.S., where we do most of our work. And we believe really strongly in the power of going together and speaking together. And I think the messaging platform that U.S. Nature for Climate provides members, and I hope there will be more members after this week, gives us a chance to say things we might not be willing to say together, or might not be able to say alone. we might not be able to say alone together. Sorry. And I think that's especially important in this particular moment where we have an unprecedented opportunity here in the US with new federal funding streams seemingly coming from all angles. It feels like one of those immersive shower moments where you get in and there's like nozzles everywhere you look and you're getting doused, and it's actually hard to know which way the soap is supposed to go sometimes. But in this case, I think we're showering the landscape of actors with resources in ways that create really amazing opportunity, but also implementation challenges. We have a wide variety of different flavors of funding, many of which you'll hear today, which are incredibly exciting. Funding through the kinds of programs you've known really well, like the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which was renewed and doubled in size permanently in 2020, and now Inflation Reduction Act, of course, the bipartisan infrastructure law. Depending on how you count those two pieces, it's either $30 billion or $200 billion that could be driven toward nature-based solutions for both climate mitigation and adaptation, and getting all of that right so that the dollars are spent not just fast and not even getting what we paid for, but what I'll be listening for today is how we spend these dollars in ways that gets us more than what we're paying for. How we're unlocking the totality of these different pieces so that they add up to more than the sum of their parts, and that they actually transform this sector. And we often talk about the kind of like the land ecosystem, how the different pieces work together. I think of this increasingly as an industrial sector. And we don't think about the nature-based solutions area as an industrial sector, but if we don't, we won't be setting ourselves up for a transformational moment, in my view, that we're seeing on the energy side, where we have an energy sector that will never look the same in the United States after this huge infusion of cash. We need to be engineering the same kinds of transformations. So there's hard dollars that are on offer right now to make that possible. There's also really innovative things that have come from some of the people on this panel that are not about the IRA, that are transforming the way we account for natural capital, the way that we verify and support commodities themselves so that they're climate smart. We'll hear a lot about that, but all of this, in my view, has to open up a new era for the land sector and its ability to mitigate climate change on its own and at a scale that is way more than we're even spending right now. So I'll leave it there. And we'll really look forward to the discussion with the panelists, and thanks for the chance to be with you.
Thank you, Sacha. Your shower metaphor washed over us all, but I hope we can at least agree that it was certified by WaterSense. So if you're having multiple nozzles, let's just hope that they're efficient nozzles. Because all climate solutions have a role to play, right? That brings us to the first of our speakers today, and I will relinquish control of the clicker to Britt Groosman. Britt is Vice President for Climate Smart Agriculture at the Environmental Defense Fund. Britt, welcome to the session today. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. And I've just realized I need to hold a clicker and a mic, and I have notes, so that's not going to work. So let's hope I remember things. No, it's fine. Thank you so much. So I'm the lead for our agricultural work at EDF, which includes the US, but also India, China, EU. So very broad portfolio. Today I was asked to pretty much give you guys a crash course into what we will be talking about. So I tried to cram a lot into these slides, and I'm happy to share them with anybody who would want some more things. So very big picture, what's the problem? Agriculture, which is what I work on mostly, is right smack in the middle of any climate issues. It is both responsible for about a quarter to a third, depending on how you count it, of all emissions, if you include deforestation led by agriculture. But it's also at the forefront. If you think about which sector really relies on a daily basis, a certain temperature, a certain precipitation, it's agriculture. So when we think about agriculture and climate, we need to look at both mitigation, reducing the emissions, but absolutely also adaptation. This is going to be crucial for food security and for making sure that rural communities can thrive. Couldn't help but put a little graph up. The blue kind of bar at the top is business as usual. This bar is where we need to be when we want to be about 1.5 degree. The slightly darker bar is the current pledges and NDCs. And you can see there is a very, very big gap to where we need to be. And that is why we need carbon dioxide removal. So not just reduction of emission, but also removals of emissions. And we can have this in technology, but guess what's really good at doing removals? Nature. So that's where nature comes in. In the US, which is what I've been asked to talk about, we have about 5 gigaton emissions per year. Currently, nature absorbs about 0.9 of that, so the smaller green circle. What we are here to talk about is how do you drive incentives and policies so that we can reach the potential of that larger green circle. Obviously, we also need to make the brown circle smaller, but that's for a different panel. US agriculture. I'm going to go through this quite quickly because I don't want to take up more time. But a lot of land is owned by the public. Most of that land is already in some kind of protection. So what we need to think about is that we've started with a certain green circle and we need to add to it. So most of that land is already in that green circle. So when we think about climate policy, we're always thinking about additionality. So that's not there. We can't take that. But there's also 1.2 billion in agriculture, cropland, and then livestock. So where in the US most environmental goals are achieved currently, it is through USDA programming, government programming. Luckily, corporates are jumping in, philanthropy is jumping in, but most of it currently is done through USDA and government financing. This up here is the results of a US study that EDF did, looking at affordable and possible in terms of economics and society and scientific possibility of the reductions that we should be looking at for the US. We should be cutting our methane emissions, think livestock, cow burps, cow manure, about 25%. We should be looking to cut nitrous oxide emissions by about 9%. That's mainly from the overuse of fertilizer. We should be cutting carbon dioxide emissions from land use changes by 72%. So one of the biggest things we can do is to avoid further conversion. Most of the carbon emissions that we might see from the agricultural sector in the future come from conversion of land. So that's a really important one. And increase the carbon storage in forests and agroforestry. So that's from this study, which you can find on EDF website. What we're looking at right now at EDF, we're in a farm bill year. Normally the farm bill should have been done by the end of September. I'm looking at Sean and others.
I don't work.
Somewhere near there. We don't even have the first bill on the floor yet. But at EDF, we've been thinking about this for a while. We've been speaking to people about what we think the priorities should be. And really, these are the priorities, right? We need really good, strong incentives. We know agriculture doesn't like to be regulated and it's very hard to regulate. So how can you provide incentives for the mitigation? So that's for reducing the emissions. We need to also build the resilience, right? If anybody this summer was horrendous in terms of natural disasters all around the world. Farmers in Europe couldn't grow rice, couldn't grow a whole bunch of crops. Freddie is here. Farmers are suffering everywhere. And I'm sure Freddie will talk about that later. And last but not least, we need to invest in innovation, data, and measurement to get us the above two, right? You can't give incentives, or it's not a very good way of using incentives, paying for performance, if you can't measure what you're getting in exchange for those funds. Farm Bill is a big opportunity, generally passed every 5 years. It might be 6 or 7 this time, I hope not, but big money, about $6 billion a year. About 3 billion of that goes to working lands programs. And working lands is what we call agricultural land and ranching land and forest land that is being used to create revenue. Most of the rest, so about half of it goes to working lands, so incentives for farmers and ranchers and foresters who are using the land, and then the rest of the money actually goes to retirement. So it's land easements, that most of that is probably marginal land where farmers get paid to no longer use it. This is the same graphic, you see the two blues, that's about 50. Key programs, I'm not going to bore you with this, but there's about 4 big programs that farmers use. And the important thing to know there, I'll go back really quickly. So our CPP is a really big one. EQIP is another big one. The big thing to remember there is that they are heavily oversubscribed. So for every farmer who asks for funding under one of these programs, about 1 out of, I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I think 2 out of 3 actually get rejected. So they are heavily oversubscribed depending on which program it is. But so there is more demand, more farmers that want to use incentives to improve than there is money available. So last summer, something happened, Inflation Reduction Act, which was a big boon for climate, probably the biggest climate bill this country's ever seen, including for agriculture. About 20 billion, depending on whether you include the rural co-ops, then it would be more, but about 20 billion going for agriculture. The way it was done was quite smart. It was investing in established popular programs. So instead of setting up yet new acronyms and new programs, it allocated that funding to these existing programs, but with a twist. Those programs are currently in what's called the conservation title of the Farm Bill, which is, you know, the name says it's for conservation. Now, to get those new extra funds under those existing programs, you have to show that you're improving climate issues. So that's the twist, that's under 2. So it has to be carbon, methane, nitrous oxide. The good thing about these programs is that, yes, you are investing in climate benefits, but you're going to get a lot of co-benefits, right? You're going to get water benefits, you're going to get biodiversity benefits, you're going to get a lot of other things. Climate might be the metric that currently, you know, creates the most funding, but when you put it in these kind of working lands, you're going to get a lot of co-benefits. One thing to remember, IRA funding was at the moment, we'll see what happens, but it was a bump. So it's not an increase of the baseline of Farm Bill, so not Farm Bill of the futures, it was a one-off bump, which you can see here. So this is Farm Bill funding, 2022 to 2023. 2033, the IRA funding is the big bump that's put on top of that. You could see it as tailing a bit longer because some of these are multi-year contracts. Now, one of the questions some policymakers and people like me interested in this are thinking about is how could we turn this into permanent funding? That's going to be the big question. So the environmental community is working with the ag sector at seeing how those funds can be best used. There is a lot of technology that needed, workforce that's needed. I've spoken to a lot of farmers who want to access some of these programs, and their local government offices have one person dealing with 1,000 applications. They're literally, half of them go in the bin. Like, it's really striking. So we need to reinvest in that. And we need to make sure that the technology is there. I'm also speaking to some farmers. There's all this stuff about, you know, smart farming, smart tools. If you don't have rural broadband, if you don't have Wi-Fi, you can't access any of those. So get measuring. Oh, and that was it. Thank you so much. Crash course, as I said. Looking forward to the panel.
Thank you so much, Britt. I'll let you have a seat. Great overview. At ESI, we do a lot of policymaker education, and we actually just concluded last week a 6-part Farm Bill briefing series, including a briefing about conservation, forestry, economic environmental win-wins, the process, and rural development and research and development. So if you would like to go into this detail, in addition to Britt's great slides and all the EDF resources, I encourage you to visit www.esi.org to check out our Farm Bill resources. Britt mentioned that we don't have bills on the floor. We don't have bill text. But when we do, we also have side-by-sides that will help you compare what's existing in the Farm Bill and what's being proposed in the House and Senate. So lots of great resources if you want to get a crash course in Farm Bill, if to the extent that that's even possible. Hopefully our resources can be helpful. I also really liked your slide with the bump. And if you notice, we're pretty early in that bump. There's a lot of up to go in that bump. And so this is a really good time to be having this conversation because there's a lot of work to do. That brings us, may I use the clicker? Thank you. That brings us to our next panelist, which Britt almost stole my segue. Heather Tallis. Heather is the Assistant Director for Biodiversity and Conservation Sciences with the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Heather, welcome to the briefing. I'll give this over to you and I'm looking forward to your presentation. No, you can have your own mic.
It's on. Yes, really? Right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks to our organizers for pulling this together. And I'll use the mic.
Yeah.
I'm excited to be here in this climate consensus conversation on this very important topic of nature and nature-based solutions. I am with the Office of Science and Technology Policy. For those of you who haven't heard of it, it's in the Executive Office of the President of the United States. And part of our mission is to advise the president on issues of science and technology, but also to work across the federal family, so across agencies on issues that have broad scope and bring existing knowledge and evidence to wise policies and to advancing science and technology for America. So it's really incredible to be in that position with a president that has set an ambitious climate goal and to be thinking about the science that we have to bring to bear to achieving that goal. And so, as has already been mentioned, one thing is very, very clear when we look at that science. A big avenue for change that we need, nature-based solutions, is not being tapped enough. We are not taking full advantage of the opportunity we have to invest in nature. On the mitigation side, as the green bubbles showed well in the last talk, in the US, we're at about 1/3 of the possible for mitigation through nature-based sources. We also have a lot of room to grow on adaptation as well. There aren't great top-line numbers for that, hint, hint, science community, but there are very clear examples for certain risks. This is one of my favorite on climate adaptation for coastal risk reduction. This is a map of the Caribbean region and a recent study that looked at the cost effectiveness of restoring coral reefs and mangroves. Every dot on this map is a cost-effective restoration opportunity where $1 invested in restoration will return at least $1 of avoided flood damages. To me, the yellow dots are super impressive. Those are a 15-to-1 return estimate, and there are many. So there really is a lot of opportunity left on the table here, and now is not the time for that in the climate fight. And so luckily, President Biden recognizes that. And last year on Earth Day, called on the federal government to write a report identifying opportunities to rapidly increase adoption of nature-based solutions. I was lucky to be able to co-chair that report for OSTP with my colleague Lydia Olander at the Council on Environmental Quality and my colleague Crystal Lehman at the Domestic Climate Policy Office. And we had the remarkable opportunity to work with 15 federal agencies, which included some of those you might expect are natural resource agencies like USDA, but also our non-resource agencies, FEMA for federal risk reduction and emergency management, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Homeland Security, our Department of Energy and Department of Defense, along with Housing and Urban Development. So just to give you a sense, to Sacha's point, this is not a nature-centric approach. This is a transformation approach for the all of government. And the main top line that all of these agencies agreed to is that nature-based solutions should be go-to options for climate equity and prosperity. They should be at the top of our list. And with the recommendations in this report, which is basically an all of government strategy, we know how to get there. So I want to show you briefly some of those top line recommendations. I'll stay at a high level, so these will seem fairly vague, but I promise there's a lot of detail in the report that I invite you to explore. And the main first message is that there's recommendations across all of the major actions the federal government can take. So this is not just about funding, this is about the whole of business. So there are recommendations for updating policies, unlocking funding, managing our own federal assets differently, building the workforce of the future, and advancing science, evidence, and innovation. All of the recommendations here are in response to barriers that the federal agencies themselves identified, recognizing that while there's a lot of positive experience in the past decades of federal investment in nature-based solutions, there are real barriers that still make it hard to make this a first choice. So along the way, we did also realize and want to elevate all the existing federal experience in this space. So the first QR code there is a nature-based solutions resource guide that we also released that has 30 federal stories of existing past investments in nature-based solutions and 175 federal resources. So a lot to build from and a lot more to go. So where to go? So on updating policies, of course, nature-based solutions have not always been front of mind in federal policymaking in the past. And so there are unintended barriers in a lot of places in policies that need to be removed. Major areas that were emphasized and where we make recommendations are on benefit cost analysis, on permitting, and on building codes. Benefit cost analysis, I think, is the least glamorous, most influential thing federal agencies do. It underpins almost every decision that's made on a new regulation, on a program, on a policy, on a project. And so there are barriers currently for agencies to really fully consider the costs and benefits that flow from nature-based solutions. So it's hard to give them an honest go when you put them on the table as an alternative. Once policies are modernized and allow nature-based solutions to be considered, of course, then they need to be funded. And as has been mentioned multiple times, there's a lot of new funding on the table, really transformational funding through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Some of that money is very directly pointed at nature-based solutions. The majority of it is not, and yet is for a purpose that nature-based solutions could provide. And so a lot of the recommendations in the report are to embed nature-based solutions in existing programs where they can serve the need. And so there's quite a few different entry points and opportunities that are receiving major funding now, where we have more room to grow with the nature-based approaches. We, of course, have pretty tremendous federal assets in buildings and lands and waters that are directly managed by the federal government. I was myself shocked to learn that the federal government manages over 300,000 buildings, which is a whole lot of infrastructure. And so a whole lot of opportunity for more green roofs and on-site water treatment facilities like the US Coast Guard headquarters that's in the picture there on the right. And a lot of opportunities for federal lands and waters, which are managed for many different purposes, to be increasingly managed to also provide climate benefits. So very specific recommendations there. Once policies have shifted and money is flowing, somebody has to be able to build nature-based solutions and maintain them and ensure they're effective over time. And here we come to the workforce, which is a major area for growth that we heard a lot about. There is not the necessary set of skills available to take full advantage of even the money that's currently flowing. And as more is directed, these skill gaps will become even more significant. As we heard in one of our roundtables, it's very different to maintain a wetland than it is to mow a lawn. So even at the maintenance level, there are really serious skill improvements and opportunities for job growth through these pathways. And the last, and of course my favorite opportunity for expansion here is on evidence, knowledge, and innovation. We do know quite a bit about the effectiveness of some nature-based solutions, especially some of that coastal risk reduction that I showed the map of. For other outcomes, we do know less. There are gaps in the evidence of how to design effectively. And so there's real need to close those evidence gaps. We, of course, also have needs to improve monitoring and validation, which we'll hear more about. And one of mine that I've worked on for most of my career, modeling to support scenario analysis, integrated models that really incorporate nature-based and other solutions have a long ways to go. And federal agencies rely on those repeatedly to inform the design of policies, to do benefit cost analysis, And so this gap in integrated modeling is a serious barrier for a lot of what could happen. So the recommendations, of course, are just a starting point. This is a very compelling all of government look at what needs to happen, but now it needs to happen. And so the roadmap was launched at COP27 last year. So we've had almost a year now of follow-on activity and time to keep driving forward and see what we can do to bring these recommendations to life. And so I'm just going to quickly give you a couple of snapshots of some of the things that have happened. Some of them I think are really quite compelling and give a sense of the kind of progress we can make. In the policy sphere, we have seen major advances in benefit cost analysis policy. Again, very underknown and highly influential thing, OMB circulars A4 and A94, named very intuitively, set the rules for all federal benefit cost analysis for regulatory impact analysis and for projects and programs. And they are under review now for the first time, literally in decades, 20 to 30 years, depending on the document. And so there are advances in those updated versions that support nature-based solutions and an entirely new guidance document that OMB is developing on valuing ecosystem services in benefit cost analysis. Those services are the flows of positive outcomes that come from nature-based solutions. And if we can better account for those in benefit cost analysis, then we can more truly assess nature-based options. So this new guidance, the public comment just closed yesterday. I'm sorry if you missed it, but that's great news because it means it's coming closer to being finalized and will become a standard practice for federal agencies. We also released the Ocean Climate Action Plan, which is another all of government strategy for how to bring ocean solutions to bear in the climate fight. And a major pillar there is ocean-based, nature-based solutions. On the funding side, we find these issues so important that we were happy to join our G7 allies this year and create a new alliance for nature-positive economies. This is intentionally a platform for ministers of finance and ministers of the environment to meet and speak with each other about issues relating to nature and the economy. So this is just getting underway, but a very important platform for us to continue to discuss and advocate for nature-based solutions. And then no small bump here since the release of the roadmap, up to 41 billion in new funding has been made available to support nature-based solutions. So these are places where changes have been made in the way the notices of funding are going out to allow nature-based solutions to be proposed. So just as one example here, the $20 billion to the Environmental Protection Agency for green banks, the initial notice of funding was very focused on technology options, which are important, but in the most recent updated funding release, they now clearly allow nature-based solutions to be proposed and covered. So thank you. It's a big deal. And there's a lot more opportunity for those kinds of shifts to happen. On the federal asset side, we've seen a couple of agencies, one perhaps less expected, take big moves in updating their own internal policies for managing their buildings and their lands and waters. The Forest Service updated their management manual for forests, and it now emphasizes nature-based solutions. And the Army has embedded nature-based solutions both in its resilient infrastructure guidance and in its lands management guidance. And the Army owns a lot of land, or manages a lot of land. On the workforce side, I saw a very positive announcement just a few weeks ago from NOAA, a $60 million offering to fund the climate resilient workforce and the climate ready workforce. So major opportunities there for people to put in proposals for building skills that will strengthen and close those skill gaps for nature-based approaches. And I wanted to bring in at least one commitment from outside the federal government. We held a summit this Earth Day on investing in nature, and the American Society of Civil Engineers committed there to working with their accreditors and building nature-based solutions into engineering training requirements, which is huge. This is a huge step in allowing the future workforce to be skilled in and aware of and knowledgeable in how to build and literally engineer nature-based solutions. And then finally, we've seen over 30 new scientific studies and resources released since the roadmap. And very importantly, released the first ever federal guidance on Indigenous knowledge. This is very important from an OSTP perspective We very much value and want to elevate Indigenous knowledge as a form of evidence. And with this guidance, there's now very clear guidance and a very clear call to agencies to do the same. And of course, Indigenous peoples have extensive experience with nature-based approaches since time immemorial, and this gives us a real opportunity to bring that to bear in federal action. So this hopefully gives you a broad sense of what's covered and what's recommended in the roadmap, and what kinds of actions are starting to happen that take those recommendations forward and really drive for the pace and scale of change we're hoping for. And so hopefully this gives you a real sense that this administration aims to achieve our climate goals, importantly, by making nature a go-to part of those investments. And that while there is progress underway, we welcome all of you in taking these same kinds of steps, developing your own roadmaps, or doing whatever you need to do to take these kinds of recommendations forward and unlock the full potential of nature-based solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. I'm sure we'll get to, we'll revisit some of those major advances when we get to our questions and answers. We're going to stay in the executive branch and welcome Sean Babington to our session today. Sean's a senior advisor with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Good morning, Sean. Your clicker.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This thing on? Yes, we got it. So one, just really appreciate this opportunity, and certainly the remarks that we've heard from our first couple panelists here. I'm gonna reference back a lot of the figures that we've heard about amounts of investment, but really try to focus in on how is this money already hitting the ground in the hands of farmers, ranchers, private forest landowners, and what are the plans for us to actually get this money out the door? We've heard already that we have public sector owned and managed lands. There's an important conversation going on there. But when we talk about privately owned lands, we need to think about our structure and how we provide the right incentives and messages for folks to actually enroll, adopt, sign up for these things. So I'm going to try and focus a little bit more on that. Hopefully we'll build on and emphasize some of the things we've heard already. So just setting the stage, right? We know that we need to achieve net zero by 2050. A ton of work needs to happen between now and 2030 to be on the right pathway for that. And in particular, when we talk about nature-based solutions in the agricultural sector, there is a appreciable amount of transformation that scientists and really smart people like we just heard from are telling us needs to happen, right? So when we think about croplands, these are our, Midwestern states that start with I and have acres and miles of corn and soybean rotations, right? We want to adopt conservation tillage, less tillage, perhaps no tillage. We want to think about things like cover crops or anything that really just keeps. It's okay. Didn't like what I had to say, drops the mic. But a great example of a nature-based climate solution that has real environmental co-benefits as well is things like cover cropping, which we know can hold more carbon in the soil, but also keeps that soil in place through the winter months, through wind events. We have a whole host of additional benefits there. We've heard about nitrogen, right? Huge issue, climate super pollutant, nitrous oxides. And fertilizer is a chief component of that conversation. So we're working in that space. Grassland conservation, wind buffers, rice cultivation is one that folks don't think about that much, but the traditional way you grow rice grows a bunch of bacteria that then give off methane, which we also know is more potent than carbon dioxide. So we're thinking about rice. It's a tougher one. And then animal agriculture, we've heard about methane, particularly enteric methane emissions. So literally the cow burps. We know there's technologies out there that can cut down on those emissions 30% or more. We need to work to bring them into our regulatory system and adopt them domestically, which they're already doing over in Europe. So I'm just going to put up maybe a little reminder of all the tools we have at our disposal at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So we've heard about Farm Bill conservation programs, about $6 billion a year of investments in traditional, I don't want to say garden variety, that's a bad pun actually that I do, but the traditional conservation programs so that certainly have climate benefits, but also think about resource concerns like wildlife habitat and criteria pollution in water and other things that were envisioned when this was first written in 1985 and the ensuing farm bills, not when climate wasn't necessarily at the fore like it is now. We've heard plenty about, and I'm going to talk even more about in a minute, but a different aspect of the $20 billion in Inflation Reduction Act funding that USDA received. Specifically, we're going to focus on the money to NRCS, which is the Natural Resource Conservation Service, one of our big farmer-facing agencies. That's the $20 billion. There's also $5 billion directed to U.S. Forest Service. U.S. Forest Service stewards the nation's national forests. That's 193 million acres. We've heard of that's a publicly owned asset, but they also have other areas within that agency that work with private forest landowners. And that's where I want to talk about how that $5 billion to Forest Service has come into play. It was mentioned briefly that the remaining money that went to USDA under Inflation Reduction Act went to our Rural Utilities Service. That's to transform our rural electric sector, more of a electric pathway rather than a nature-based solutions pathway. Still relevant, but we won't focus on that today. I'm also going to talk about an initiative that we have that's outside of Farm Bill conservation programs and outside of the IRA called the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities opportunity, which I think all of our partners here are involved in one way or another, and is a really exciting initiative that we just celebrated the 1-year anniversary of. And then we may not dwell on it, but would be remiss if we didn't talk about opportunities for private investment to come in and drive a lot of this change. We've talked a lot about public investment, and that's great. And we're going to want to see more and more of that. But our research shows, our economic research shows that we're going to need additional investment beyond just what we can expect from the public sector to achieve some of these transformational outcomes in nature-based solutions, particularly in agriculture. That's where you have things like high integrity, high quality credits that can be traded in carbon markets, other ecosystem service markets, and how do we think about that as part of the solution? So Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities. This was an initiative that the secretary, my boss, Secretary Vilsack, who's across town at the Rockefeller Foundation, speaking with their CEO right now, talking about this very same stuff. He set up right when he came into office. Folks may know this is his second tour of duty at USDA. He was the secretary during the entirety of the Obama administration and took the job again for secretary to come back and do that. But I do think that climate smart agriculture is one of the big drivers and certainly one of the priorities that he's outlined for us at USDA. So under his existing authority, where he can use USDA resources to support production of commodities and marketing of commodities, he, Undersecretary Robert Bonney, who was my predecessor in this senior advisor for climate job, and our senior team, pulled together this Climate Smart Commodities Partnership Initiative, which is basically a $3 billion grant program that we put out on the street and said, folks should come together. Producers, NGOs, land-grant universities, private sector corporations, come together and show USDA how you would plan to use some of this $3 billion to increase adoption of climate smart ag practices and climate smart forestry practices. And it was a pretty open-ended request. We didn't know what we were going to get back, but we felt like it was important to put some incentives out there. We got back over $20 billion in applications for this $3 billion opportunity. And ultimately, about a year ago, announced that we had ranked those $20 billion. We ended up with the top $3 billion or so worth of applications and made those awards to 141 different projects covering all regions of the country, all major commodities, really, really critical involvement from land grant universities, minority serving institutions, and then partners from across the corporate and NGO sectors that put together some really compelling proposals about how to get these climate smart practices on the ground, adopted at scale, and how to incorporate really robust MMRV, right? Measurement, monitoring, reporting, verification in everything we're doing. So we can track this. We can find out what works and what doesn't. We're going to learn a lot from this. We know the potential's there. We've heard about that from our speakers before. We don't necessarily have a clear glide path from point A to point B. And what we're going to learn under this partnerships program, what we'll learn under our IRA investments is going to really help us sort of separate what works and what doesn't. So mentioned this briefly, but these were the key principles for the program. Voluntary incentive base. I mentioned the unique partnerships we were looking at. Every single project had to have a plan to enroll or involve small acreage or historically underserved agricultural or forestry producers. Equity right alongside climate is a key pillar, both for the broader administration, but certainly for Secretary Vilsack. And this was a critical component of every project that was awarded. Early adopters, we hear about this a lot that, oh, I was doing cover crops 20 years ago. Where's my money? You know, we felt like that's actually a fair conversation to have. And we want to make sure that those pioneers are getting acknowledged for the work that they've done, but also have an opportunity to participate going forward. So again, 141 projects, $3 billion. It's actually more akin to a number that's much larger than that in terms of total investment because of matching requirements that private sector partners brought to the table in their applications. 71, about half of those are small grants to smaller projects that are really focused on those small acreage landowners and are partners that USDA has frankly not done a very good job of historically reaching. So that was a big component here, and that was about half the awards. At the end of the day, we're not there yet, but we think this is 60 million metric tons or more sequestered or removed or avoided, and the equivalent of 12 million cars a year. So that is a crash course in the partnerships for climate smart commodities. That's a 40-minute presentation on its own, but moving through the Inflation Reduction Act, we've heard about this already, right? USDA received all this money. I've outlined it already. The 20 billion to NRCS for our normal farm bill conservation programs, but with a climate focus is a really key component of our narrative here. And, you know, we are, as Britt mentioned, about a year past the enactment of that bill. The department has been working incredibly hard to get those resources out the door and into the hands of farmers. And what that means is not just like, oh, we, you know, are going to just queue up a bunch of checks to whoever, you know, we have to put out competitive grant notices of funding opportunities where then people have to apply. We have to rank them. There's a whole host of process steps here that the team went through at a very aggressive rate to start getting this money out the door. And I'm going to repeat something that Secretary said at an Axios event yesterday morning, that we just released the application numbers and the interest from that first year of the IRA spending yesterday. And all those programs that Britt laid out at the top, EQIP, CSP, RCPP, the easement programs, every single one of them got more applications in this first year than Congress made funding available for. For RCPP, it is 4 times more, like an incredible response from farmers, ranchers, forest landowners with interest in these funds that even with this generational investment in IRA, we don't have enough money to go around. So we're looking at certainly reauthorizing the Farm Bill that has the traditional Farm Bill conservation resources, spending these IRA resources as wisely, but as quickly, given the urgent need here as we can, and then continuing to make the case that whether it's additional public sector investment from Congress or it's private sector investment that we can incentivize through the tools that are in our toolbox, that we keep these resources flowing to rural America and to rural communities. I want to mention on the forestry side, we'll skip the clean energy side for now, at least. On the forestry side, we've seen the exact same type of excitement. I was with the secretary in the Midwest last week. We were in Wisconsin to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of the Climate Smart Commodities Partnership on Wednesday at an organic dairy farm that is already enrolling hundreds of dairy farmers in Wisconsin and the broader Midwest in these projects. And then the next day, we went to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and announced one of the Forest Service IRA programs, which was a $1.5 billion investment in USDA's urban and community forestry program to plant trees, retain trees, maintain trees in urban areas across the country that have tremendous opportunity to improve the lives of people in those communities. We know heat stress and a whole host of things that are really negative effects by not having adequate tree cover is a profound challenge in a lot of these communities. We made 385 grants across all 50 states, multiple tribes, 2 US territories. And that was 1.5 out of that $5 billion of the Forest Service resource mentioned at the end there. So back on the point about interest, that was $1.5 billion. We got nearly $7 billion in applications for those resources. So if you hear that producers don't want this money or we should rescind this and put it towards something else, remember those oversubscription numbers, because it is a key component of how we approach this. That there is demand out there. We want to get these dollars in the hands of rural communities and the people who live there. Last thing I just want to dwell on for a second is the importance of MMRV. I mentioned it briefly before, but it really does underpin all of this work. If we can't sort of just pat ourselves on the back and think that we're making a difference, we need to make sure we're making a difference. The climate doesn't have time to wait. It's not good for us to not have confidence and feel like there's integrity in these practices, the markets that want to incentivize these practices. So we've really focused on this as a component of everything we're doing in this arena. The Inflation Reduction Act, as part of that $20 billion to NRCS, included $300 million specifically for MMRV. And this is just the statutory language right there, but you can see the focus on carbon, methane, and NOx, and doing a whole host of things to really bolster our confidence in these practices to make a difference. We took that $3 million, the secretary announced this maybe 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago, at an event with the president's national climate advisor, Ali Zaidi, in Washington. We laid out these 7 work streams that are going to comprise that $300 million spend down. I'm not going to read all of them, but you can think about the first one as a soil carbon monitoring network. This is literally going to be thousands of sites in different soil types around the entire country, where we're going to find out a lot more about how carbon is stored, carbon migrates, carbon is released from these various practices. There's a robust debate, other people in this room, certainly Heather, are much smarter on this than me, but about how far down do we need to sample? How often do we need to sample? What happens if you till this often? These are critical questions that actually underpin whether or not we're going to realize the potential of nature-based climate solutions. So this is my last slide and just a little bit of a chart about how this is all going to fit together. It's a little bit busy. Our economists and scientists can explain it better than I can, but really there are 3 scales that we are going to be collecting this data and reporting it in various things, including our NDC to the UN. So national, program, entity, what the models and tools are, and then how we're going to get the emissions estimates about what we're doing at all of those scales that can help us really build out this narrative that these practices aren't just kind of window dressing or feel-good things. This is real reductions and sequestrations that are a really meaningful part of the climate solution discussion. So I will stop there. Thanks.
Myself, I lose myself when people start talking about no-till. It's not really my fault. Building off something you were just saying, the Inflation Reduction Act, $369 billion for climate. It's going to get us toward our Paris Agreement goals. But it also serves a different purpose, and that is really a proof point that there is a lot of demand. The IRA was specifically structured around incentives, good things that people want, and it's really demonstrated across the entire legislation that there's a lot more demand for this. We skipped over the clean energy, but if anyone would like to learn more about the RUS Rural Utility Services programs, ESI has a lot of resources. There was a report just out this week that also talked about the multiple times of demand compared to the funding availability for those programs. PACE, a New Era. The deadline for New Era was just last week. Lastly, we've had a lot of folks join us in the room since we started, and I just wanted to remind everyone that after we have 2 more panelists, after that we will have a Q&A. And so if you have questions for folks who are in the room, you'll have an opportunity to ask. And then if we don't get to everybody, hopefully we'll have a few moments to hang out and network afterwards. Our next panelist is Freddie Davis. Freddie is the Director of Rural Training Research Center from the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, past EESI briefing panelist. So I know what you're in for. And Freddie, I can't wait to hear your presentation today. I'll let you take one of those microphones, and Sean's got the clicker, and we'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, no clicker. Oh, okay. First off, to tell y'all just a little bit about Federation of Southern Cooperatives. Federation of Southern Cooperatives is an association of cooperatives mainly based across the Southeast United States. Those cooperatives are primarily comprised of underserved producers, forest landowners, row croppers, specialty crops. So that's our mission is cooperative development, of course, advocacy, and land retention. The first two support land retention. Overall, our goal is for land retention amongst underserved landowners. We've lost land. Underserved landowners have lost land at a super high rate over the last 20, 30 years. So our goal is to maintain that land base or increase that land base as an organization through advocating for those landowners and through using cooperative model of working together. So I want to talk a little bit about the programs that's out there that Sean talked about and how they relate to underserved landowners that we represent, how we're using those programs, how we're suggesting to use, how we're using those programs as tools for the producers that we're working with. And it's a couple of key points. We'll start off talking about the climate smart commodities. I think climate smart commodities is something that's really key. It's based on addressing the system overall, working with the producers from the ground and getting those products to the market. And the reason that's important to us is because in order for a landowner to retain that land, they've got to have an interest in that land. And most of the time, that interest is financial. So it's about producing a product and getting that product to market. And so the climate smart commodities opportunity is geared around promoting the adoption of regenerative agriculture, nature-based solutions, and then supporting that adoption, and then promoting the markets that will recognize the value of that product. So it's looking at that whole system. So that is something that's super important to our producers, is being able to realize financially the benefits of nature-based solutions through the promotion of marketing. So that's key. Sean talked about EQIP and he talked about CSP. Those are key programs, the flagship programs, so to speak, of NRCS. And those are programs that really get these practices to the ground for producers. It addressed the small things, the things that a lot of time in these rooms we don't talk about. We talk about livestock, we talk about the vegetable productions, and we talk about forest land, but we don't talk about the resources to replanting. And that's what these programs address. It addresses replanting, it addresses afforestation, reforestation. These programs address fencing, you know, for your livestock. They address the watering issue. They address protecting water quality. And so those programs are key, and they're key for the producers that we're working with. Again, it's about land retention. And dare I say, it's for our producers, land retention is that land not being a liability, but being an asset. And one of the things as an organization, what we've got to do is show the importance of regenerative agriculture and how regenerative agriculture or nature-based solutions can be an asset to that producer and making it an asset. So what these programs do is allow these producers to adopt these concepts and minimize the risk of adopting those concepts. So that's the importance of these programs to the producers that we're working with. We'll talk about capacity building. So we start talking capacity building, and these programs allow for capacity to be built in areas of nature-based solutions. So right now, it's a struggle for these producers to produce a product and get it to market. We talk about fertilizer, we talk about all of these solutions that's not really friendly to nature. Well, the producers don't have really the capacity to do anything any different than what the norm is, or to change the way that they're operating. And so what happens is with these opportunities is that capacity is changed. Now we've got capacity because for underserved landowners, every one of these projects have got an underserved component in it. So that's building capacity within these communities in order for these to build a capacity for these producers to then participate in these markets, in these opportunities, in adopting nature-based solutions. So some of the things I think that's where the opportunities are is also where opportunities are to increase the ability of USDA to help these communities. We talk about capacity, and we talk about addressing the system. I think where the opportunity is for there's a need for these communities and capacity to really be targeted as an opportunity, because these fundings are coming down so quick, as all the panelists is talking about. This funding is coming down really quick because we've got a short time to work with. But within these communities where we're trying to target these nature-based solutions, we're pouring 5 gallons of resources on the communities, and the communities right now has only got a teaspoon capacity to take them. So what we're having to do is I think one of the things we need to do is step back and look at these communities that we're targeting, the underserved communities and the smaller, and look and see what it looks like as far as scalability for these communities to adopt these practices and all of this that we're putting on them in an efficient manner. I think that's where some of the opportunity lies within the nature-based solutions that we're suggesting now, as a whole. So that would be it for me. I'm not going to take a whole lot of time.
Thank you, Freddie. You can have a seat there too, if you'd like. Our final panelist is actually coming to us via Zoom. Emily Luscombe is the Natural Resources Director for the Intertribal Agricultural Council, and we'll put her up on the screen in just a moment. And we'll invite her to the conference. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm apologizing in advance if I sound a little croaky. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to be there in person because I'm recovering from the flu. So if you can't hear me, please say something or put it in the chat so I can try to talk a little bit louder. Are my slides coming up on there, or are you guys wanting me to run them separately?
That is a great question. We are getting you up on the Zoom here in the room. We can see your slides.
That's not the beginning though.
Okay. Emily, we're going to let you share the slides.
Okay. It says you have to stop sharing first. All right, and see if it'll. All right, can everyone see those well now?
We're almost there.
Okay.
Not for this crowd. The light needs to turn a little bluer before my jokes will hit. There you go, Emily. We can see your slides now and you're sharing.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about climate change and Indigenous agriculture. And I didn't want to waste one of the slides either. So this cover slide here is an example of the ways that tribes use their resourcefulness to help with climate solutions and work across multiple agencies, leverage funding, work within tribal funding, foundations, other things combined to get really important projects done. So the picture with all the cups is from UG Butterfly Farm in Oklahoma, and this is on Muscogee Creek land, and this is a family farm, and they work on farming butterflies, and they work on also doing a seed bank pollinator friendly plants so that they can work on pollinator protection. So they are actually doing farming, but they are farming stuff that is to assist other farming and to assist with climate solutions. And so this is just a really interesting project where it started out in like a little single wide trailer and just a couple of people working on it, mostly the family, and now it has like an area for teaching. It has, you know, several large buildings. They've expanded into this large seed bank, and they are also running a nonprofit for the seed bank to be able to provide those for free to tribes to make sure that the climate practices are being improved, because we all know that there's a huge loss in pollinators with climate change. And so they're really working to help remedy that. And then the picture here where you can see a little waterway there, this is the Duckwater Shoshone Reservation in Nevada. And they are using funding mix as well, because they are improving the practices of the grazing and the agriculture in the area to restore the hot springs that were there naturally, both their riparian zone and to protect an endemic endangered fish that is there. And so when the tribe was able to take back their traditional hot springs, they started working on projects to restore them. Now, both of these have used combinations of Fish and Wildlife Service, foundation grants, state grants in some cases, EPA funding through the Clean Water Act program, and NRCS funding. And so this is a really good example of how to mix all of those together.
Emily, can I interrupt you for one moment? We're having
Yeah.
would you be willing to take your camera off? I think
Okay, yeah.
for your audio, and also I think we're a little quiet here in the room. If there's a way to increase volume, I think that would help. That's probably less.
I have it on maximum for volume on this end.
That's probably a thing for us here in the room, but thank you very much.
Okay, did that help?
I think so.
Okay, all right, perfect. Oops, okay, there we go. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of context as well, because tribes have a little bit of a different situation than most people. There are some barriers and contexts that are similar across tribes and other BIPOC communities and disadvantaged communities, but there's also some that are very different. And so I just wanted to make sure that I gave that background here. Also a little bit for us at the Intertribal Agriculture Council, we look at agriculture in a much more Indigenous perspective. And so we're looking at everything that's food, fiber, and medicine. and we're looking at a whole systems approach. So my department focuses on working with people on practice changes to get more regenerative agriculture out there. And then we have other departments that work on getting people signed up for the programs, work on legal and policy and advocacy, work on economic side of things. And so we have, a very wraparound approach. But from my side, we work on a much broader view of regenerative agriculture because we're working on helping people to understand the whole ecosystem function and to work on all aspects of that, because we know that it is a system. And that is a more Indigenous approach that also helps us to understand how not to leave out an important piece that might come back and cause other pieces to crumble in the future. So while we do have soil building and soil health as a cornerstone of what we're doing, it's not the only thing that we do. We do pollinator protection, water quality, integrated pest management, climate change adaptations, drought mitigations, all those kinds of things are done within our department. And so I want people to understand that that's kind of the context of our organization, but then the context of tribes is that prior to colonization, tribes had been practicing traditional ecological knowledge since time immemorial. And so all of the USA was under regenerative agriculture. It's just that agriculture was done in a way that people don't always recognize it because it was landscape scale. However, it's really important to remember that it wasn't like this land was uninhabited. Nature doesn't exist without humans. We are one of the animals that is part of nature, but it's important that when we are a part of nature that we're also working in balance with the rest of nature. And that's what TEK did. And that's what was happening here with the regenerative agriculture that was happening prior to colonization. And so TEK is a place-based scientific knowledge that has been experimented and tested for thousands of years to come up with the best management practices for an area. A lot of those have been borrowed into what we are calling regenerative agriculture today. And it's also something where it can really look at microclimates and have a lot of solutions when it comes to nature-based solutions for climate change. Tribes are rarely given any credit or compensation for the knowledge that they brought forward. And tribes have been pushed into fractionated, fragmented, marginalized lands where a lot of times their options for even practicing these things are limited, and they're often in the places that are most impacted by climate change. And that's also true of a lot of other BIPOC communities. And so a lot of government programs on top of all of this made things inaccessible for tribes historically because you either had to be a landowner or they specifically excluded Native Americans or tribal trust land, or they had terms that didn't go with a tribal constitution because of sovereignty waivers or length that leases had to be done, things like that. And so this is something that's being worked on to be improved. And the importance of TEK is now also starting to become more recognized. So these are just some of the barriers that are faced by tribal producers that people might not always be aware of when they're creating programs. So there's a lot of jurisdictional related issues. I'm not going to go into this too much because if I did, this would be a 4-hour presentation on its own. If anyone has ever looked at American Indian law, that federal Indian law is the most complicated law that you will ever see, and jurisdiction on reservations with different land types, areas that are fractionated, the checkerboarding, things like that is really, really complicated. And sometimes it makes access to programs extremely difficult. Ownership related issues, like I was talking about, because most people are practicing agriculture on tribal trust lands. And so sometimes because it's technically owned by the federal government, not all programs are applicable there. There's also been blatant discrimination in the past, which is something that's improving, but still does exist. The marginalized lands issues are huge. And the marginalized lands are also smaller. So there's acreage issues that a lot of programs have a minimum number of acreage that has to be served. And sometimes tribes cannot do that, but are sometimes most in need of these programs. There's also been programs like boarding schools and assimilation programs over time that have caused the loss of tribal knowledge. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done in some areas to regain that knowledge, to be able to get back to that harmony and those TEK practices. There's use of different terminology. And so a lot of times we find that there's like a need for a translator between producers and the federal government, because the acronyms that are used, the different practices, and the way that best management practices are used and listed with the government isn't always the same way that a tribe would list their practice. So sometimes they're already doing a practice and they don't realize that they are because the terminology is very confusing for them. And then Also, like Freddie was talking about, sometimes it's the overall tribal capacity is the same kind of issue here, and that sometimes the ability of a tribe to deal with a really large program is not always there. And so it's also really important to remember not to forget about some of the smaller programs that can make really big differences at tribes. So these are some of the improvements that are occurring between tribal governments and the US government. So the tribal provisions that have come out in the Farm Bill in the past, the ones that are being negotiated now, the improved climate smart programming and having set asides for tribes and disadvantaged communities, and some of the new programming is really important because tribes are not going to be able to compete on acreage, on dollar value, on things like that, but they are in marginalized areas. And in many cases, they need these climate solutions urgently, more than a lot of other communities do. And tribes are tied to place. And so tribes can't just pick up and say, well, this isn't working so well here, I'm going to move somewhere else. They don't have that same ability or flexibility as a lot of other populations. There's a recognition of jurisdictional issues and discriminations. And so there are remedies for some of those coming out in some of the new and revised programs to try and fix that. And there's also inclusion of more funding for organizations like us at Intertribal Agriculture Council to work directly with tribes in a more culturally inclusive manner, and to gather information on how agencies can do better and take that back to them so that we can move forward in a manner that is a good way for tribes, a good way for the environment, a good way for the federal government. And there's more programs that can be used overall for climate smart agriculture and nature-based solutions. And one of the things that tribes really work on doing is mimicking nature as much as possible with agriculture. And so that's one of the things that we teach back to some of the other tribes, again, is coming back as close to nature as possible, but that's starting to become more recognized in these programs. As far as the new climate related programming is concerned, I'm not covering as much of it, partially because it's been covered a lot by the people who've presented before me, but also because the new programs that are coming out are really kind of hard to evaluate exactly everything that's happening on the ground right now, because they're still new. A lot of them are just coming into fruition and people are just starting to work on those projects. However, a lot of them are really helpful and are being used in conjunction with a lot of the smaller programs, the older programs. These are being used on like large scale projects where there's a lot of cooperation between different tribes, organizations, agencies to try and get the best climate solutions out there possible. Sometimes this is a really good benefit. However, sometimes the focus on large producers can push out some of the tribal programs that are smaller. And sometimes the partnerships that are required for some of these larger grants are hard for tribes to access directly because of their rural nature and the size that they are able to contribute to a project. Sometimes that is rectified by us being able to work directly with producers or other organizations similar to us, but sometimes it is still hard for tribes to access some of these. Overall, though, they are getting a lot of dollars out onto the ground to do really good projects with these nature-based solutions. And so some of the programs also are working on getting data out for best management practices for future programming. So looking at how well different things actually work in different environments, because some of our best management practices that we have been looked at as just like a broad scale. And this is giving chance to do research on more defined cases and being able to work forward and getting understanding of what happens in different environments and climates and get those practices refined. So in some cases, these programmings are being also combined with some of the older programs, and the new programs are being leveraged to further enhance existing programs. This one, I'm not going to go through everything that's on here because the slides are going to be available to people, but this is something I just wanted to cover, is that these are some of the current climate smart projects that are happening, is looking at what the regenerative and climate smart agriculture is actually creating for the producers financially, because there's been very little research on that subject. And so this is looking at how that can work. It's also looking at some of the driving factors in the ag supply chain and lending programs. And there's also other USDA programs right now that are looking at evaluating the actual data on the climate and the carbon sequestration that's happening on different agricultural projects in different areas. So it's helping to actually gather data on that carbon and looking at some of the traditional practices that are being used by tribes. And that doesn't mean that it's complete traditional farming. Sometimes this is using more like traditional mob grazing type of things on cattle ranching and stuff like that to improve and restore some of the grasslands. So those tribes use a lot of the existing programs, and I want to point this out because I think it's really important to remember as we create new programs and initiatives that we don't lose or forget about other programs that are great complements to those that people are still using, even if they weren't necessarily developed for climate smart ag or nature-based solutions, that a lot of times they are actually still being used for these things, and that they're not always USDA programs that are being used for ag, that a lot of times tribes are using a combination of these things. And so the EQIP program, the CRP, the CSP, and the value-added producer grants are some of the ones that are most commonly used by tribes. And a lot of times these are also combined with, mix of funding from other agencies. Tribes often get BIA funding through 638 grants for water resources and climate change. This is really important for tribes because a lot of tribes don't have a lot of other sources of income. Because of the area that they're in, they become dependent on some of these federal government programs. And the 638 grants are some of the only ones that lose their federal characteristics. And so therefore, tribes are able to use these as match for other programs, and it'll allow them to access programs they could not otherwise access. So those are really important to mention and remember. There's a lot of US EPA funding that is used to leverage. So a lot of times Clean Water Act programs, especially the 319 non-point source pollution programs, are used a lot in conjunction with agriculture. And they're used to protect the riparian areas, to do agriculture better, work on fencing and things like that. But there's also other EPA programs that are sometimes used as well. Sometimes there's things with cleanup that are used through the GAP program. There's sometimes Superfund and brownfields programs will clean things up or make things appropriate to be able to be used for agriculture and do soil building. There's some BOR funding that is commonly used, their water smart programs and their technical assistance programs. There's NOAA's fisheries programs sometimes that are used, FEMA mitigation programs. And so it's really really heartwarming, I think, to see the way in which tribes have this ingenuity to take all these different programs and use them together to create whole ecosystem restoration projects. This is an example of an existing program that I had a feeling nobody else was going to mention in their slides, which is the value-added producer grants. And so a lot of times people don't think of value-added producer grants as being something that's nature-based solutions or climate smart ag, but the Hopland Band of Pomo Indians used this to create something, a program that they called TAP Meets Tech, which is Tribal Agricultural Programs Meets Traditional Ecological Knowledge. And this helped to refine agricultural resources that were already existing. So a lot of times when some of the reservations were bought back and the tribes got land again, they had apple orchards or vineyards or other agricultural resources there that had been kind of let go to waste. And so they started using traditional ecological knowledge to restore those and use better nature-based solutions to use those agricultural resources, and also to plant in their native plants, basket weaving plants and medicinal plants and things like that, and restore some of the traditional ecological knowledge and usage of plants at once. They created a farm stand, a farmer's market, they had canning classes and all sorts of other food preservation. And so they really helped to restore agriculture, climate smart practices, and traditional knowledge and plants all in one small program of a value-added producer grant. And so sometimes I think that's something that is forgotten, the different kinds of things that can actually be done under that program. And then this is something else that a lot of times people don't really think about, is stewardship agreements. And so tribes have the tribal land that they're stewarding, but there's also stewardship agreements that can occur for co-management of federal lands that are in traditional territories. And this is something that's increasing a little bit, and these are funded agreements, but then they can also be used in conjunction with other grants. And once a tribe has a stewardship agreement, it allows them to apply for other grants for that project and that area that they are helping to steward to really improve it. And so one of the areas is I used to work for the Washoe tribe of Nevada and California. And there's an agreement up on the shores of Lake Tahoe in an area known as Meeks Meadow. And it's the Myalawata project. And I have to apologize because I could not find the special characters on our slide making program. So that is not spelled exactly correctly for Washoe. But the Washoe people used to have a summer camp up there, a traditional summer camp in that area. And they would do things that are agriculture, but weren't being looked at as agriculture, right? There was tending, seeding, burning of the crop at the end of the summer. There was collecticing, coppicing, all these things that were done that actually really are agricultural practices that were for traditional foods and medicines and fiber plants up in this meadow. And this was an important area that was visited every single year. The area, because of poor forestry practices and things that have happened over time, and this is Forest Service land, has become so overgrown with lodgepole pines, and the meadow has been kind of almost completely removed because it hasn't had that traditional burning that has happened every year and that tending and that agriculture happening in that meadow, that the water table has been sucked down so low that the stream is no longer actually Meeks Creek is no longer actually reaching Lake Tahoe. And so the tribe is working on removal of those lodgepole pines with the Forest Service and the restoration of those native plants so that marshland meadow comes back, so that those traditional plants come back, and so that it restores the soils there and restores the hydrology of the area. And so this is just a really good example of something that is often overlooked and people don't realize how important this can be. And then a lot of times, the Forest Service has such a large area to deal with, BLM has such a large area to deal with, that it's very hard for them to create these specific projects to really do nature-based solutions on some of those federal lands, but partnerships with tribes can help achieve that. And then I just wanted to give a little bit about the Farm Bill. I'm not going to cover the stuff that was already covered, but the Native Farm Bill Coalition was launched in 2017 to elevate tribal needs. It now has more than 170 members working together to form the priorities that are put forward and advocated for. The 2018 Farm Bill was the first farm bill that this was worked on with the Native Farm Bill Coalition, and it was a great success of working together with the federal government to improve conditions for tribes being able to access programs and being able to do good work in agriculture. And a lot of times with tribes, that automatically means climate smart practices. So there were 63 provisions that were included to benefit Indian country. And some of these provisions included conservation. There was some really important provisions that were included, including allowing beginning producers to participate in the conservation programs, because before that there had been a time threshold for different programs. And I think the smallest program threshold was that someone had to already be a producer for a year before they could participate in the programs. So that created a couple of problems because there is some of those issues, right, about the early adopters. So then sometimes if you started out doing your program right, then you would have been considered an early adopter and you wouldn't be eligible for some of the other programs. Or you had to start out not using climate smart practices or nature-based solutions in order to be able to become an adopter once you had reached the time threshold for becoming a producer. And a lot of new producers come in and say, I want to do this right. How do I start out right? So this was a huge improvement. And it's one of the things I don't see talked about very often. And so it's one I wanted to highlight. And the Native Farm Bill Coalition works really hard to advocate for the inclusion of tribal provisions. And so this is things including, traditional practices. It includes things like access to programs, the issues with acreages, things like that that are really important, and having some of those tribal and disadvantaged community set-asides put in. And so one of the examples of this is that there's a proposed provision for the 2023 Farm Bill for the seeds and breeds. And so this would help provide tribal seeds and networks, and this allows better adaptation to microclimates and climate change through specific breeding. So this is something that's really important. And right now, there's over 150 suggested provisions for the Farm Bill for 2023. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Emily. We have a little bit of time for questions before we have to relinquish the room. Sacha, if you'd like to join us at the front, if you have any comments or any responses to the questions too, please feel free.
I'll be Sean.
Questions in the room? Would you like to go first, sir, or would you like to go second? Okay. Let's start with you and then we'll come right to you, Arturo. Please go ahead. And I'm going to repeat the question for Emily's purposes and for the live cast.
There have been a lot of on and off attempts through policy both on state and federal level to promote cover cropping. What are some things you guys have learned from those previous attempts on what to do and what not to do, and how is that informing the sort of cover cropping and other different soil building?
Thanks for the question. For the benefit of Emily in the live cast, the question was about cover cropping. And something that's been sort of encouraged on a stop and start basis. Thoughts from the panel, Emily, you included, of course, about what could we be doing differently or better to encourage greater adoption of cover cropping, or if there are similar practices maybe that you would want to mention. Emily, maybe since you're online, we could start with you and then we can hear responses from folks in the room here.
I would say that cover cropping is kind of most usually actually part of traditional practices. So it's definitely something that we encourage where there's not perennial plants that are there. We also do encourage a lot of perennial planting. And it is something that is encouraged with all of the soil health practices that we promote, because we try to encourage people continuously having soil cover and having living roots in the ground year round as much as possible, because that's so important for feeding those soil microbes, breaking down that carbon into the soil, and having a healthy system.
Other comments, Freddie?
Yeah, I think the adoption, really the incentivizing behind the cover crop, because it's this you'll get with producers, you'll get these legacy stories about having cover crops on your land, the resistance issues, with some cover crops, and they become legends with producers. And so what ultimately, when you have these incentives out there for producers to adopt it and minimize that risk, that's one of the largest benefits to a lot of these climate smart programs, is having those incentives. So I think once our producers are starting to adopt these as practices, and it's like Emily said, a lot of these have been practices that been adopted because the equipment wasn't there to do a lot of the things that the tilling does now. So a lot of producers, it's things that's happened in the past, and they're just going back to what our forefathers were doing on the property. So I think this incentive is really driving the adoption, and we're seeing it as something that's really viable. The producers are able to get in the fields a little quicker than some of the other producers that don't have cover crops. And so as those type stories start replacing the stories of resistance, and then that we're seeing adoption really take off.
Yeah, that's something we've heard a lot as well. Some of the other problems seem to be, so you just said, like by example, right? A lot of farmers, the cover crop coverage is still very low in this country. It's like 5% or something. It's very low, even though these incentives have been around for a really long time. And a lot of it is where it does happen, it's because a farmer next door has done it and it worked, right? Farmers are very much, so the incentive is really important, but also example is important. The other problem we have is we do have to look at cover crop incentives within the bigger package of incentives. If your crop insurance penalizes you if you have used a cover crop, then you are not going to use a cover crop. So one of the things we need to really look at is when we design these programs is how they interact with each other, because farmers are very confused, and they will crop insurance will always reign over any smaller benefit that you can get under conservation type.
Thanks, Britt. Gentlemen here in the front, please feel free. I'll repeat your question for the live cast.
Sure. So thank you. Thank you, panel. And I'd like to hear a little bit more from you guys. comprehensive panel on how to ensure that the IRA is the beginning of systemic change rather than a big bump in the road, or a big bump in funding, federal funding, particularly in the face of the kind of things that Britt talked about, big ag financing approaches, and big systemic financing approaches that could erode funding, that could erode the benefits of the IRA. And I want to frame it in two ways. One, a challenge, one, an opportunity. The challenge is that the funder of climate leadership of BIPOC communities and of nature-based climate solutions and regenerative agriculture, it's been disturbing to me over the past few years to see many folks in the DJ and climate world attacking regenerative agriculture and nature-based solutions as a false solution, arguing, oh, that's very temporary and all that stuff can just go away, and there's really no way to know for sure what kind of benefit it's providing. So I've seen that cross my screen over and over again. So I'd like to hear how you guys are responding to that. And the opportunity to Heather's point is in terms of, I think, changing practice, perhaps can change things like insurance, what have you, is how can we, everyone's a little scared of the eventual takeover by the AI overlords, but like, how can we actually use AI as a tool and put it into the hands of gentlemen like Freddie and others to really advance and have that data affect all of these systems, policies, insurance approaches, and even big ag that I would like them to go away a little bit.
So there are a couple different elements of that question. One was how to ensure that the IRA is not a bump in the road, but instead is puts us on a glide path for continued greater investment. Second element of the question was, well, I'll go to the third one about artificial intelligence and AI, if there are ways that we could be deploying that a little bit better. And then the second element of the question, which now is the third element of the question, is how do we build bridges between perhaps skeptics of nature-based solutions and to ensure that folks who are primarily motivated by environmental justice or climate or mitigation or adaptation, how do we ensure that they all are informed and can come together around the real benefits of nature-based solutions? Hopefully that was a fair paraphrase. Sacha, Freddie, Heather, Britt, I'll let you go first, and Emily will be sure to come to you too. We won't forget.
I guess to go back to the incentive and with the insurance, I think is part of that question. I think the importance of a lot of this is the diversity that it's encouraging in a lot of the projects and a lot of this push that we're doing, because insurance is not an issue with the producers I'm working with, because they 9 times out of 10 don't qualify for insurance. So it's a moot point. And I think that's something that's something we've been advocating for as an organization. I think when we start talking, ensuring that IRA is not a bump in the road, I think it's building systems kind of like the intent of the climate smart commodities, where we're addressing and bringing partnerships, public, private, and government to the table. I think that's how we ensure that this trajectory on is sustainable, is by building those type of partnerships and it being diverse and inclusive of all parties. The AI development, I think, is really something that we're pushing as an organization. Is how do we get this to be a little more cost effective? How do we share this information? Because one of the things that we're cautious of is that a lot of the funding that's going out is going out fast. We thinking is causing an artificial cost to what these projects actually run after the 5 years. So are we setting a tone now that MMRV is going to cost $350 an acre to do an estimate? We're setting that tone now. I think as we need to change that or look at that, because that's not going to be sustainable, especially for the smaller producers. So I think that's something that we need to, so I think artificial intelligence, sharing information is something that's really gonna make sure that that these projects are sustainable. What was this, the building the bridges? Yeah, I think I addressed the building the bridges. I think we, of course, that using that communication across lines and building those partnerships, and it's something that's really gonna build those bridges to sustainability.
Thanks, Freddie. Sasha, please.
Thanks for all three of your questions, Arturo. I think I just want to build off something that Freddie said, which was that the Climate Smart Commodities Program is a great point to focus on, because it is about changing the underlying production of specific commodities in the marketplace in a way that are basically unlikely to be reversed, right? It is not, none of the, and the other, another point I want to make about this is that nothing you heard today, almost nothing, is driven by a carbon market concept. These are push incentives, they're draw incentives, they're push mandates, they're things like that are not based around the idea that you're somehow makes the EJ critique especially pointed around offsetting. This is about changing the way that we produce food and fiber in the country, and what I'm really curious about, Freddie, is how we. Your comment around the pricing is kind of fascinating. Like, are we paying too much? Are there ways to make these programs work in a way that we are de-risking the transition to new practices that are ultimately better for the economics of especially for small farms that will really only need to be financing the transition, not the forever production? And that's because that's the permanence part. If we put producers in a better place on the other side of this with all of this money, there's no going back. And that's what I think we're all really, really interested in. And maybe, and to that point, like the insurance, I know you guys can speak to that more, the insurance component, the de-risking of all of this is really fundamental. And if insurance is what producers respond to, then that's our next goal, right?
Yeah, I just want to build on what you're saying, Sasha, because I do think a lot of the opportunity with the IRA and the bill funds is to make things people aren't used to thinking about business as usual, right? What are they pushing? Climate, nature, diversity. And the point is, think about it. Here's some money to figure out how to do it. And then those become standard practice. And if these programs are designed that way, and the kind of capacity building that we've been hearing about through the whole session is part of it, then this is building new standard practice, new business as usual. And, you know, the point I emphasized several times about embedding funding of nature-based solutions in core programs is exactly that, right? So a couple more examples: FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities programs gives preference points to nature-based projects that have a nature-based component. That's a risk reduction and an emergency response program. It's not a nature program, and it's not a climate, well, it's increasingly becoming a climate program, but not by design, right? And so that's an embedding of a way of thinking in a core program that's going to have funding every time there's a disaster. No matter what IRA or bill or any other new law does, that money's going to appear, it's going to be spent by communities. And those programs also continually see more interest from communities in having a nature-based avenue in. So if these funds are really a transition point, a transformation opportunity, then you are unlocking trillions of dollars, not a one-time billion bump, for continual investment in the kinds of changes that we need. Oh, I didn't say anything about AI, just for fun. I know I'll get in trouble if I don't say that. To definitely respond on AI. So, you know, we heard a lot about sort of farm scale needs for information and opportunities for monitoring. The policy changes I mentioned on benefit cost analysis, and the one that I didn't mention on natural capital accounts, where there's huge new open windows for data to show up in analyses about the stream of benefits from nature, and AI and data, big data, have huge opportunities to serve those gaps and to be developed in a way that really brings the power of what's possible to those analyses. So I think, again, there's just a huge open door right now. How far new application and new adoption goes will depend in some cases on what data is available. And so there's a huge opportunity with AI to fill those gaps.
Go ahead, Britt.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on your second piece very quickly, which was about how to sort of make things permanent and build bridges. And you attempted to say, oh, I want big ag to become smaller. And that's a really slippery slope. As somebody who works a lot in the politics of how to get stuff done, if we make this a marginal issue and we don't make this something that big ag wants, it is only going to be an IRA bump. It is not going to go into the future, right? So we need to just make sure that this is a mainstream issue that all farmers can benefit from, big and small, because otherwise we will not win this battle. So that's just on the politics reality check, unfortunately.
Emily, I want to make sure you have an opportunity to weigh in too, if you have anything you'd like to add.
Yeah, I won't repeat anything that's already been covered, but I will say that I think that most people who take an incentive to do something like this are people who really want to do the right thing and really want to use nature-based solutions, and they just need the incentive to be able to make that financially feasible to get them on the ground and doing it. And so I think that there is a lot of sustainability in that, because making the transition is usually where the largest cost is. And so most people who are doing it will continue to do it. And so I think that when you put a little bit of funding forward, that has exponential impacts into the future. So I think that's really important to remember. Most people want to be good land stewards. Farmers have usually been doing this for generations and they care about the land. They just don't always have the tools, the resources, the educational background on practices to do the right thing. But usually when given those tools, people will do the right thing to make things better. And so I think that's really important. And less on AI, but I guess slightly related is, I think that one of the things that I'm seeing a biggest possibility for real improvements in ecosystems and stuff in the future is the virtual fencing technology as it improves, because this really allows for the use of virtual fencing for fire breaks. It allows protection of certain areas a lot easier. It allows for being able to move cattle in rangeland areas more easily without having to drag out fencing to really remote or steep areas, so that more regenerative ranching can be done in those areas. And so I think there's just a lot of possibilities coming up with the virtual fencing for the West, especially for arid rangeland areas, and improving some of those areas that are burning really heavily.
The worst part of being the moderator is having to call time, and we are going to lose the room in just a moment. But before we do, I just wanted to say thank you again to our great panelists, Britt, Heather, Freddie, Sacha, Emily, and Sean in absentia. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives today about this topic. Thank you very much. I'd also like to give a last shout out to our friends at US Nature for Climate for bringing us together. Thanks to Nathan and to Francis. I'd also like to thank my colleague Anna McGinn, who's not with me today. She is watching us remotely, but I'd like to thank her as well for everything she contributed to helping me be here and to help with everything we do with Nature for Climate. So I hope everyone has a great rest of your Wednesday and a great rest of your climate week. And we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Thanks so much for joining us.
But when I was actually supporting